Good morning, my name is Jacob O'Donnell and I'm going to be reviewing Carl Jung's Psychological Types. Carl Jung is a Swiss psychiatrist from the early and mid 20th century who specialized in analytical psychology, being one of the pioneers of that field. His writing style is very verbose and lengthy, delving into a lot of information in short spans of time while still being extremely nuanced. Jung was one of the most influential psychologists of this time period, rivaling Sigmund Freud and Maslow, who he both inspired and was inspired by. He focused on ideas like the unconscious and subconscious, archetypes, and even formed a behavioral theory under the idea that we have cognitive traits and biases that form how we perceive the world around us. If you are familiar with the 16 personalities model originating from Myers-Briggs that distributes a scaled personality test, then understanding Carl Jung's typology theory isn't too unfamiliar. Carl Jung wrote the psychological types with the desire to make himself independent from Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler, wanting to show how his perspective differed from theirs. Jung claimed that it is one psychological type that determines and limits a person's judgment. He proposed that Freud's perspective was extroverted and that Adler's perspective was introverted. Although he doesn't talk about Freud nor Adler much in the book, he said in interviews that he wanted to separate himself from them by sharing his perspective on how behavioral personality worked. The book was written in the 1920s at the early dawn of behavioral and analytical psychology. Psychology had been pretty stagnant before the 20th century and didn't really focus on the behavioral consistencies and categorizations of people. Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, and Carl Jung were the three main psychologists during this time period who focused on the behavioral self. This book is primarily written for two groups of people: intellectuals in the field of psychology who want to understand Jung's perspective, and people who want to take a dive into the self and use the theory to apply tendencies they find to a behavioral type. In order to understand this book, it makes more sense to start with the ending section than go back to the front. This is because he explains the theory in the back half and uses the front half to paint a lot of the ideas behind the creation. He writes in sections of big ideas and connections rather than developing points beyond their section, only occasionally mentioning them again if needed. One thing about Carl Jung that is hard to get used to is his verbose nature of writing, mixed with how he paints stories and anecdotes. The start of the book talks about a story of two Christian philosophers and how they each use different ideas as a way to devote themselves to God, showcasing the framework they think and explaining later how psychological types contrast them. In order to fully understand this story, we need a brief description of Carl Jung's theory. Carl Jung says that there are 8 cognitive functions of personality, which are essentially a basis to how we perceive the world. 4 of these types are extroverted, meaning they focus on the outside world and outward energy, usually expanding perspectives, and 4 of these types are introverted, meaning that they focus on the inner world or inside energy, usually narrowing perspective. Each of these groups can be separated into intuition, thinking, feeling, and sensory, giving 8 total functions. I won't dive too much into how these functions work, but there is one that you need to know to understand the purpose of the story he opens the book with. The first type is introverted thinking, which Carl Jung describes as logic that comes from within, often forming the world around its framework rather than changing its ideas. It can take symbols and ideas and turn them into very strong worldviews, taking information from outside and putting it inside the framework as a way to conform the outside world to a way that the perceiver can understand. The story starts with a Christian philosopher named Tertullian, probably not the one you're familiar with. Born in 160 AD, he was obsessed with the truth and passion of God, and was very strict with the ideologies that aligns with God's belief, no matter the circumstance, showing some of his introverted thinking already. Jung goes very in-depth with the character, but all you really need to know is essentially he castrated himself as a way to sacrifice his sexual desires, getting closer to God in his ideology by eliminating his sinner temptations, and also straying away from intellectualism as a way to get closer to God. The justification for his castration shows an introverted temperament because he was focused on eliminating his inner temptations, focusing on the self in a sense rather than the external things he would have to do to connect with God. The reason for his introverted thinking temperament is because he sacrificed his inner intellectualism as a way to sacrifice what felt like the real world to him, wanting to ascend into self-actualization and spirituality through getting rid of what made him him. There wasn't much concrete evidence provided for his theory, as the theory is based on a lot of subjective perception. He would occasionally use stories as a way to paint pictures of how the ideologies worked, and most readers understand that there isn't a way to provide much evidence to a theory such as cognitive function, as well as they understand his credentials as one of the most intellectual and successful psychologists in the world. Overall, I walk away from this book with a lot of new perspective and knowledge. I learned a lot about the cognitive personality theory and as Jung himself. I think he did a good job at presenting the ideas as just ideas without overbearing the reader with confidence in his theory. He simply gave his ideas, and I think there was a lot of merit to them. The book was extremely impactful for the world of psychology, and his credentials make his thoughts a lot more valid. This book is very verbose and intense and wouldn't be a worthwhile read for people not extremely interested in learning about Carl Jung or his theories. I am feeling a decent to strong 8 on this book, and I'm looking forward to reading more books from Jung.
I love underline flopper.